The mist clung low to the pine trees that surrounded the quiet fields of Three Pines Ranch, and the early morning air smelled like wet soil and faded memories. Hallie Monroe, dressed in worn boots and a tan canvas jumpsuit, stepped out of the barn just as the first slivers of sunlight began to cut through the fog. She moved with purpose, but her eyes were distant, haunted in some quiet way. Her life had slowed since her father passed, and the silence of the ranch had become both her comfort and her burden. She was reaching for the bridle on her mare, Mabel, when she heard it, soft hooves padding cautiously through the dirt behind her. Turning around slowly, Hallie froze. A foal stood just beyond the trees, pale, trembling, and thin. Its ribs were visible beneath matted cream-colored fur, and its legs looked almost too weak to hold its body. Yet there it was, staring directly at her, as if it had been searching for her this whole time. Hallie knelt down instinctively and stretched out a hand, her heart tightening with caution and awe. "Where did you come from, little guy?" she whispered. The foal didn't back away. In fact, it took a shaky step toward her, then another, until its nose nearly touched her open palm. She didn't recognize it from any neighboring ranch, and it bore no brand or rope marks. Still, there was something familiar in its eyes, something that made her breath catch. Curious, Hallie stood and took a few steps back toward the barn. The foal followed, slow but determined. She stopped. It stopped. She walked in a circle. It mirrored her. This wasn't random. This animal wasn't lost. It had chosen her. Mabel, still saddled, snorted and turned her head, ears twitching toward the strange visitor. But Hallie couldn't take her eyes off the foal. The way it watched her felt intentional. Then a memory hit her like a thunderclap. Her father, Royce Monroe, kneeling in a stall years ago, holding a newborn colt with the same pale coat and eyes full of fire. "This one's got the Monroe mark," he had said, pointing to the faint scar-like line on the left hoof. Her gaze dropped, trembling. The foal before her had it too. That exact mark. Hallie's knees weakened. Her hand went to her mouth as her heart thudded in her chest. The foal from her childhood, the one they lost during a storm over a decade ago, it couldn't be. And yet, here it was, standing right in front of her, staring like it had something to say, something only she could understand. Hallie led the foal, now quietly nicknamed Buckshot, into the smaller side barn, a place usually reserved for recovering horses or injured strays. He followed her without hesitation, never straying more than a few steps away. His loyalty unsettled her. She had known animals her whole life, but this wasn't instinct. It felt like recognition. As she unlatched the old gate and let him step inside the straw-covered stall, a wave of emotion hit her. This space hadn't been used since her father died. Not since everything changed. She stood by the door, arms crossed, watching him explore the stall. He sniffed the hay, nudged the wooden post, then turned his head toward her again, those eyes still locked on hers like magnets. Hallie couldn't explain why, but she felt like he was trying to tell her something. Not in a fairy tale way, nothing magical, just something buried, something forgotten. She pulled out her phone and called the only person she trusted with questions like this. "Dean Briggs, Veterinary Services," came the voice on the other end, familiar and steady. "It's Hallie. I need you to come by. I've got a foal here that doesn't make any damn sense," she said. Her voice cracked slightly, and Dean paused before responding. "I'll be there in 20. While she waited, Hallie stepped into the main barn and ran her fingers over the old tack bench where her father used to sit sharpening tools. Dust covered everything now, but memories stirred with every creak of the wood. She remembered Royce's stories, wild tales about bloodlines, special horses, and the weight of legacy. He always said their family horses were more than livestock. "They remember things," he once told her, "even when people forget." Back then, she thought it was just sentimental nonsense. Dean arrived in his beat-up green truck, wearing the same weathered leather jacket he'd had since high school. He stepped out with a quiet urgency, nodding at Hallie before following her to the stall. When he saw Buckshot, his eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Where did you find him?" "He found me," Hallie replied, her voice low. Dean stepped inside, examining the foal's legs, teeth, and flank. He paused at the left hoof, fingers lingering on the faint scar line. His face turned pale. "Hallie, this mark, wasn't this on that colt your dad lost years ago?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she looked at Buckshot again, his head lowered, his body still, like he was listening. And in that quiet barn, filled with dust and ghosts, Hallie felt something stir. This wasn't just a strange return. This was the beginning of something that had never truly ended. Dean stood silently for a long moment, staring at Buckshot as if the foal might suddenly speak. Hallie noticed the change in his posture, the subtle way his shoulders stiffened and how his hand instinctively brushed the back of his neck. He was remembering something, too. "You don't think this is?" he started, but didn't finish the question. Hallie didn't answer. She walked to the far wall of the barn where her father used to keep old records, pedigrees, vet reports, letters. Most of it had been untouched since the funeral. She opened the metal cabinet and winced at the smell of mold and dry paper. Dozens of envelopes and notebooks sat in disarray. She didn't know what she was looking for until she saw it, an old manila envelope with her father's handwriting across the front. "Monroe Bloodlines, Private." Her breath caught. With shaking fingers, she opened it, revealing a letter yellowed with age and a black-and-white photograph clipped to the top. It was her father, much younger, holding a colt. A colt that looked exactly like Buckshot. Dean took the letter and read silently while Hallie watched his expression tighten. "This is dated 2009, he said. "It says the colt was part of a breeding experiment. Your dad didn't register him. He said he was keeping him off record for safety reasons." Hallie frowned. "Safety from what?" Dean shrugged, handing the paper back. "He doesn't say. But he mentions something about the Barrow family. You think he meant Virgil Barrow?" Hallie's stomach turned. The Barrows owned the neighboring ranch, and her father had stopped speaking to Virgil years ago. No one ever said why. There had been rumors, whispers about land disputes, horse theft, even something darker, but nothing ever confirmed. Just silence, like so much else in her family's past. If my dad hid this foal, if he was trying to protect him from someone. Her voice trailed off, but the question hung heavy between them. Outside, the wind had picked up. The barn doors creaked, and Buckshot flinched but didn't move away from Hallie. She reached out and gently touched his neck, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the dust and old straw. "He came back for a reason," she whispered, almost to herself. "Something's not finished." Dean's voice was quiet. "You think your father was hiding more than just a horse?" Hallie didn't look at him. She was staring at the letter again, her father's words swirling in her mind. There was a single sentence at the bottom, written in a rushed hand: "If anything happens to me, don't trust Barrow. And don't let them take the foal." The next morning, Hallie stood at the edge of her property, staring across the old fence line that separated Three Pines Ranch from Barrow land. The trees looked the same on both sides, tall, cold, and still, but something about crossing over that boundary made her skin crawl. She hadn't spoken to Virgil Barrow in over a decade. No one in town really had. He kept to himself after his wife died, and his only daughter, Lenora, was rarely seen. But if her father's warning was true, the Barrows knew more about Buckshot than they ever let on. She didn't tell Dean she was going. He would have tried to stop her, or worse, offered to come along. This was something she needed to do alone. With Buckshot safe in the barn and Mabel saddled and ready, Hallie rode out just after sunrise, the chill of the wind biting through her jacket. Every step her mare took toward the Barrow property felt heavier than the last. Old memories surfaced. Tense dinners, hushed arguments, the way her father would lower his voice any time Virgil's name came up. The Barrow house sat on a hill, its porch sagging under years of neglect. As she approached, a tall figure stepped out, Virgil himself. Older than she remembered, but no less intimidating. His shoulders were broad, his beard now more gray than black. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "Hallie Monroe," he said, spitting into the dirt. "Never thought I'd see you back on this side of the fence." "I came to ask about a foal," she said, voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "One that disappeared over a decade ago. My father was hiding him. And your name's in the letter he left." Virgil's face didn't change. Not a twitch. He looked her up and down, then turned without a word and walked back toward the barn behind the house. After a moment, Hallie followed. Inside, the barn smelled of oil and dust. Tools lined the walls, sharpened, clean, too clean. Virgil stopped beside an old workbench and picked up a rusted horseshoe. "You ever wonder why your daddy stopped coming around here?" he said. "Wasn't just bad blood. He took something from me. Something that wasn't his to keep." Hallie stepped closer. "Are you talking about the foal?" Virgil turned then, his eyes hard. "That horse was bred from my stock. But he was born on your land. Your old man claimed him, said it was for the best. We fought. He cut ties. That's all there is." Hallie didn't believe him. Not entirely. There was too much left unsaid. Too much in her father's letter that didn't match this version of the truth. But before she could speak again, a voice came from the shadows. "Daddy," said a soft voice. Lenora Barrow stepped into view, her eyes fixed on Hallie. "She deserves to know. She needs to see it." Virgil froze. His jaw clenched. And in that second of hesitation, Hallie knew there was something more. Something buried not just in the past, but maybe somewhere on this very land. Lenora's words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Virgil's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. Hallie took a slow step toward the younger woman, her eyes narrowing. "See what?" she asked quietly. Lenora didn't look at her father. She looked directly at Hallie, eyes full of a strange mix of fear and guilt. "It's in the east pasture," she said, "behind the old windmill." Then she turned and walked away, her boots crunching on the barn floor, disappearing into the fading light. Virgil stayed silent. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with something he wasn't ready to confess. Hallie didn't wait for his permission. She walked out of the barn, crossed the yard, and headed east. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows over the land. The windmill creaked with every gust. It had been years since she stood on Barrow soil, but her boots knew the way, as if the ground itself remembered. Behind the windmill, the earth was uneven, as if something had once been disturbed. A wooden fence, half-rotted and overgrown with weeds, marked the edge of a space that didn't seem to belong. Hallie paused at the gate. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she climbed over and stepped into the quiet field. That's when she saw it, an old maca stone, leaning slightly to one side. Faint letters were carved into the rock. "Dusty." Her breath caught. Dusty. That was the name her father had whispered once, long ago, when she was just a girl and he'd shown her a newborn colt with a pale coat. Not Buckshot. Dusty. "It's your grandfather's line, through and through," he'd said with pride in his voice. And now, here was a marker. A grave, a lie, or something worse. Hallie fell to her knees in the tall grass, brushing dirt from the base of the stone. Around it, she noticed old hoof prints, more recent than she expected. Someone had been here. Recently. She turned her head sharply when she heard movement behind her. Virgil stood by the gate, his face unreadable. "We buried him here," he said quietly. That colt. After the fire. His voice cracked on the last word. Hallie stared at him, confusion tightening in her throat. "What fire?" she asked. Virgil looked away. "The one your father never told you about. The one that nearly burned us all to the ground." And in that moment, Hallie understood. Buckshot wasn't just a mystery. He was a ghost, alive, but tied to something buried so deep in her family's past, no one had dared to speak of it. The word fire echoed in Hallie's ears as if the wind itself had repeated it. She rose slowly from the grass, her hands still dirty from clearing the overgrowth around the marker. "You said he died," she said, voice low and shaky. "You said you buried the colt here." Virgil nodded once. "We did." But the way he said it, hollow, uncertain, made her chest tighten. Hallie stared at him, trying to find the truth in his weathered face. "Then who? What is in my barn?" Virgil didn't answer right away. He looked down at the stone, then at the sky behind her. "That night, the barn caught fire. We were breeding two bloodlines, yours and mine, trying to create something stronger, smarter. Royce and I thought we were building a legacy. But when the fire started, only one colt made it out alive." He hesitated. "We thought it was the other one. The weaker one. So we buried the remains and kept quiet." Hallie felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. "So you're telling me you buried the wrong horse?" Virgil exhaled hard. "We couldn't be sure. The fire was too fast. Everything was ash and confusion." Royce claimed the survivor, said he knew by the eyes. "But I always doubted it. I never saw that same fire in him that day. Not until now." He looked at her, sharp and direct. "That foal in your barn? He has that look. The same look your father once called unmistakable." The silence between them thickened. Hallie took a step back, her thoughts spinning. Had her father known the truth all along? Had he raised the wrong colt, or had he known exactly what he was doing, and lied to protect it? The letter, the secrecy, the fear of the Barrows. It all pointed to something much deeper than a breeding experiment gone wrong. Back at Three Pines Ranch, Buckshot paced the stall restlessly, as if he sensed a storm coming. When Hallie returned, she stood by the gate, watching him. He stopped and looked at her, eyes wide, still, waiting. She stepped inside and reached out, laying a hand on his neck. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, tears pressing behind her eyes. "But you are." And deep down, she knew, whatever he was, whatever truth he carried in his blood, it was time to face it. No more running. No more burying the past. The sky turned steel gray as a storm rolled in over the hills. Hallie sat alone in the barn, her back against the wall near Buckshot's stall. The wind moaned through the cracks in the wood, and the foal shifted restlessly, occasionally glancing at her with those wide, knowing eyes. She hadn't told Dean what Virgil said. Not yet. She didn't know how. The truth was still too tangled in confusion, and in something far more painful, betrayal. She pulled her father's letter from her coat pocket again, reading the words she'd memorized days ago. "If anything happens to me, don't trust Barrow, and don't let them take the foal." Her father had known. He had known all along that something about Buckshot was special, or dangerous. But he never told her why. And now she was left chasing ghosts, trying to stitch together a story buried in ash, lies, and silence. The barn door creaked open suddenly, and Dean Briggs stepped in, rain dripping from his hat and jacket. He took one look at Hallie's face and said nothing for a long moment. "I've been driving around all day," he finally muttered, "trying to figure out what the hell is going on. You disappear. Then Virgil Barrow shows up at the feed store asking for fencing wire." He paused. "That man doesn't fix things. He covers them." Hallie stood slowly. Her voice was rough. "He says there was a fire. Years ago. Said they buried the wrong colt." Dean's brow furrowed. "And you believe him?" Hallie hesitated. "I don't know. But I saw the grave. It's real. And he knew the name. Dusty. No one else would have known that." She crossed her arms tightly. "Maybe we've all been wrong about what happened back then." Dean glanced at Buckshot, who now stood perfectly still, watching them both. "If he's who you think he is," Dean said softly, "then he survived something no horse should. And that kind of survival, it changes a creature. Sometimes for the better. Sometimes not." His words echoed deeper than she expected, and she wondered if he was still talking about the foal, or about himself. The storm outside cracked open the sky with thunder. Hallie walked up to Buckshot, placing her hand gently on his forehead. He didn't flinch. She looked back at Dean. "I need answers. And I'm done waiting for someone else to give them to me." Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. "Tomorrow, I'm going back to the nursing home. My mother may not remember much, but she was there. And if there's even a piece of truth left in her, I need to hear it." The next morning, the sky was still bruised from the night storm, but Hallie didn't wait for it to clear. She drove in silence, hands tight on the steering wheel as the road curved toward the nursing home just outside of town. The old building stood like a relic, quiet and sagging, with faded shutters and creaking porches. She hadn't visited her mother in nearly 3 months, not out of neglect, but because every visit chipped away at her heart. Edith Monroe had once been the sharpest woman Hallie knew. Now, her mind wandered like wind in an open field. Inside, the scent of bleach and old paper filled the air. A nurse greeted her with a polite smile and guided her down the hallway. Room 12B. Edith sat by the window, her white hair loosely pinned back, a blanket draped over her knees. Her eyes were glassy, lost in the cloudy world she drifted through most days. "Mom," Hallie said softly. Edith blinked, then slowly turned her head. Her gaze settled on Hallie's face, and for a moment, just a moment, there was recognition. "You cut your hair," Edith said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Hallie let out a shaky breath. "A while ago, yeah." She pulled a chair close and sat beside her. "I need to ask you something. About Dad. About the horse he kept hidden. Do you remember a colt named Dusty?" Edith frowned, her fingers twitching against the blanket. "Dusty, the one with the eyes like yours." Hallie froze. That wasn't something she had expected to hear. Her mother's gaze drifted again, then narrowed. "There was a night. Firelight everywhere. Royce was shouting. I told him we shouldn't keep secrets from you." Her voice cracked, trembling like thin ice. "But he said if anyone found out, they'd come for him. Said the horse had blood too old, too pure. Not registered, not traceable. He was protecting the legacy." Hallie's mouth went dry. "What legacy?" she asked. But Edith didn't answer. Her eyes had moved again, lost in some memory she could no longer hold. The nurse returned gently, giving Hallie a signal that the visit needed to end. She stood, kissed her mother's forehead, and walked out slowly, heart thudding in her chest. The words echoed, "Too pure. Not traceable." The Monroe line. Her family's horses. Had they been part of something bigger than she ever knew? Something secret, maybe even illegal? The past was no longer just history. It was alive, tangled in Buckshot's blood. Back at the ranch, Dean was waiting in the barn, arms crossed, eyes wary. "Well?" he asked. Hallie didn't speak right away. She stepped into Buckshot's stall, looking at him not as a mystery anymore, but as a messenger. "My dad didn't just protect him," she said quietly. "He hid him from something. From someone. And whatever it was, it started with our name. Dean looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't question her. "Then maybe it's time we stop digging in the dirt," he said, "and start looking in the records." That night, Hallie and Dean sat side by side in the loft of the main barn, surrounded by boxes of her father's old papers. Dust floated in the lantern light, and the air smelled of leather, hay, and age. She hadn't opened most of these boxes since the funeral. Some were labeled, others not. As the hours passed, their fingers turned black from ink and grime. But just as she was beginning to lose hope, Dean let out a sharp breath. "Here," he said, holding up a thick folder. "Registry documents. Breeding records. Looks like your father kept duplicates of everything, even the ones he never filed." Hallie took the folder, flipping through pages filled with pedigrees and lineage charts. Then she found it, a name she'd never seen before, scribbled in her father's tight handwriting: Ashfall's Dust. The page listed his dam and sire, but the bloodline traced back generations further than she expected, not just to the Monroe Ranch, but through a now-defunct stud farm in Texas known for rare, pure bloodlines. Horses bred in secrecy, off the official books, meant for private sale to collectors and foreign buyers. Her breath caught in her throat. "This isn't just about bloodlines," she whispered. "It's about ownership. Control." Dean scanned the documents over her shoulder. This farm, Clear Hollow. It went bankrupt after a scandal. There were accusations of illegal breeding, forged registries, and the Monroe name shows up twice on this list. Hallie stared at the names. Her grandfather, her great-uncle. They'd been part of it. "That's why Dad never filed Buckshot's papers," she said slowly. "If he had, someone would have come looking. And he couldn't risk that." The final document was a letter, unsigned, but written in language too personal to be from anyone but her father. It read, "He's not just a horse. He's the last clean line. If they find him, they'll claim him. And they'll erase everything we stood for." Hallie felt her throat tighten. Her father hadn't just been protecting a colt, he was protecting a legacy from being twisted into something corrupt. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open. Buckshot stood in his stall, ears twitching, eyes locked on the entrance. Hallie turned sharply, expecting wind, but instead, she saw headlights outside. A truck pulled up. A dark silhouette stepped out, tall and deliberate. Virgil Barrow. Hallie stood quickly, her chest tightening. "What the hell is he doing here?" Dean moved beside her, calm but tense. "Maybe he knows what we just found. Maybe he's known all along." Hallie stepped down from the loft, heart racing. She was done hiding behind grief and old stories. The truth was here now, printed in ink and stained with time. Buckshot wasn't just a survivor, he was proof. Proof of a bloodline others had tried to bury. And now, with one chapter left, the past was knocking at her door. One last time. The air outside the barn was heavy as Hallie stepped into the yard, her boots pressing into the wet dirt. Virgil Barrow stood near his truck, arms crossed, eyes unreadable under the glow of the headlights. Dean remained by the barn entrance, silent but alert. Hallie walked toward Virgil, heart pounding, the file of documents clutched tight in her hands. "You knew," she said without hesitation. "You knew what Buckshot really was. And you knew my father was hiding him for a reason." Virgil didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry decades of regret. "I knew what that colt was," he said. "I helped breed him. Your father and I, we wanted something different. Not for money. Not for control. But for preservation. That bloodline, it was meant to stay in the shadows. Because once it got into the wrong hands, it stopped being about the horse. It became about power." Hallie's voice trembled, but she didn't flinch. "Then why did you lie? Why let me believe he died?" Why mock a grave for a horse you knew might still be alive? Virgil looked down. Because we were scared. The people who funded Clear Hollow, they didn't just walk away after the scandal. They wanted those horses back. Dusty wasn't just rare. He was irreplaceable. Royce took him, changed his markings, and raised him as if he was lost. I buried a decoy to protect the secret, and I've lived with the guilt ever since. The barn light flickered behind them as thunder rumbled low in the distance. Hallie stepped closer, her eyes burning. I'm not hiding him anymore. If someone wants to claim him, they'll have to go through me, and through the truth. She held out the file. The story ends here. My father's legacy, our family's name, this horse, they belong to us. Not to some forgotten registry or corrupt breeder trying to reclaim control. Virgil looked at the folder, then at her. Slowly, he nodded. Then do it right. File the papers. Register him under your name. Let the Monroe line stand clean again. Your father wanted that, even if he didn't know how to make it happen. With that, he turned and walked back to his truck, leaving only the sound of gravel under his boots and the weight of closure behind him. Back inside the barn, Hallie returned to Buckshot. He stood calmly, as if waiting. She laid the folder down and stroked his neck, her voice soft. You were never lost. You were just waiting for someone to see you. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, quiet, like a final cleansing. The past had been buried, burned, rewritten. But in the end, the truth had survived. And so had she.